Now, he continues on the book, but I'm going to move a little bit forward here to where he's moving towards the front. And we'll go back to the book. After trudging about 6 miles, we arrived at the camp and found that it was out of food and that all the tents were occupied. We stretched out our sleeping bags on the ground and went to bed supperless. We had had no food all day. Next morning, we were told that we ought to jump on an ammunition lorry if we wanted to go any further on our journey. Nobody seemed to want us particularly, and no one could give us the least information as to where our division was. It was another lesson, if that were needed, of our total unimportance. So these guys are looking to find where they're supposed to report to so they can go fight in the war. And people are like, hey, I got no time for you. Go figure it out. While we were waiting on the roadside, an Australian brigade of artillery passed by. The men's faces were dreary with fatigue. The gunners were dismounted and marched as in a trance. The harness was muddy, the steel rusty, the horses lean and discouraged. We understood that they were pulling out from an offensive in which they had received a bad cutting up. To my overstrained imagination, it seemed that the men had the vision of death in their eyes. Towards the evening, the thunder of the guns had swelled into an ominous roar. We passed through villages disfigured by shell fire. Civilians became more rare and more aged. Cattle disappeared utterly from the landscape. Fields were furrowed with abandoned trenches, in front of which hung entanglements of wire. Mounted orderlies splashed along sullen roads at an impatient trot. Here and there we came across improvised bivouacs of infantry. Far away against the horizon towards which we traveled, Hun flares and rockets were going up. Hopeless stoicism, unutterable desolation. That was my first impression. The landscape was getting increasingly muddy. It became a sea of mud. Dispatch riders on motorbikes traveled warily, their feet dragging to save themselves from falling. Everything was splashed with filth and corruption. One marveled at the cleanliness of the sky. Trees were blasted and seemed to be sinking out of sight in this war-created slough of despondency. We came to a brow of a hill. In the valley was something that I recognized. The last time I had seen it was in an etching in a shop window in Newark, New Jersey. It was a town from the midst of whose battered ruins a splintered tower soared against the sky. Leaning far out from the tower, so that it seemed she must drop, was a statue of the Virgin with the Christ in her arms. It was a superstition with the French, and I remembered that so long as she did not fall, things would go well with the Allies. As we watched, a shell screamed over the gaping roofs, and a column of smoke went up. As we entered the streets, Tommies more polluted than miners crept out from the skeletons of houses. They leant listlessly against sagging doorways to watch us pass. If we asked for information as to where our division was, they shook their heads stupidly, too indifferent with weariness to reply. For the next 3 nights we slept by our wits and got our food by foraging. So we know this is World War I. We know it's an absolute nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. And what was surprising me, this guy's an officer and he has no idea what he's doing. He's just walking around, and people are so despondent from the war that they just don't even care. Back to the book. There was a headquarters nearby whose battalion was in the line. I struck up a liaison with its officers and at times went into the crowded tent, which was their mess, to get warm. Runners would come there at all hours of day and night bringing messages from the front. They were usually well spent. Sometimes they gassed, but they all had the invincible determination to carry on. After they delivered their message, they would lie down in the mud and go to sleep like dogs. The moment the reply was ready, they would lurch to their feet, throwing off their weariness as if it were a thing to be conquered and despised. Go ahead and read that one again. So these guys are dog tired. They lay down in the mud. Somebody's preparing a reply for these messages. And then the moment the reply was ready, they would lurch to their feet, throwing off their weariness as though it were a thing to be conquered and despised. I appreciated now as never before the lesson of guts that I had been taught at Kingston. The other side of the town, the ravages of the war were far more marked. All the way along the roadside were clumps of little crosses, French, English, German, planted above the hurried graves of brave fellows who had fallen. Ambulances were picking their way wearily, turning with the last night's toll of wounded. We saw newly dead men and horses pulled to one side who had been caught in the darkness by the enemy's harassing fire. In places, the country had holes the size of quarries, where mines had exploded and shells from large caliber guns had detonated. Bedlam was raging up front. Shells went screaming over us, seeking out victims in the back country. To have been there by oneself would have been most disturbing, but the men about me seemed to regard it as perfectly ordinary and normal. I steadied myself by their example. It's interesting because we're talking about this and it sounds like hell and they're not even on the front yet. They're not on the front lines. This is behind. Mm-hmm. That's something also we were talking about today. Like, you can see these guys, whatever pain and suffering they're feeling, they're not showing it. Yep. And he knows he can't show it. And that kind of bolsters them all and makes them all stronger. Yeah. Back to the book. About 7 o'clock, as we were resting, the evening hate commenced. In those days, the evening hate was a regular habit with the Hun. He knew our country better than we did, for he had retired from it. Every evening, he used to search out all communication trenches and likely battery positions with any quantity of shells. So, 7 o'clock at night, the Germans would they knew all the positions because they had surrendered them. So then they would just start dropping bombs, dropping artillery on the known positions that they knew. They knew the trenches where they built them. Horrible. His idea was to rob us of our morale. I wish he might have seen how abysmally he failed to do it. Down our narrow valley, like a flight of arrows, the shells screamed and whistles. Where they struck the ground looked like Resurrection Day, with the dead elbowing their way into daylight and forcing back the earth from their eyes. There were actually many dead men just beneath the surface, and as the ground was plowed up, the smell of corruption became distinctly unpleasant. So these guys are buried. They're buried in 4 or 5 feet of dirt, and these shells come in and dig them up. Presently, the shells began to go dud. So imagine this: you're hearing these big explosions, and then some shells hit, and there's no explosion. You know what that means? It means it's gas. We realized that these were gas shells. A thin bluish vapor spread throughout the valley, and breathing became oppressive. Then, like stallions kicking in the stalls, the heavy guns on the ridge above us opened up. So now the friendly guns start to open up. It was fine to hear them stamping their defiance. It made one want to get grips with his aggressors. In the brief silences, one could hear our chaps laughing. So I want you to imagine this. This is awesome. You're getting shelled. You're getting crushed. There's dead bodies coming up from the soil. There's gas in the air. And here we go. In the brief silences, one could hear our chaps laughing. The danger seemed to fill them with a wild excitement. Every time a shell came near them and missed, they would taunt the unseen Huns for their poor gunnery, giving what they considered necessary corrections. 5 minutes more left, old cock. If you'd only drop 50, you'd get us. So he's giving corrections to the guns. These men didn't know what fear was, or if they did, they kept it to themselves. And these were the chaps whom I was to order. So we haven't heard too much about that. And, you know, Tony and Leif talked about it, you know, being get shot at and being in really close calls situations, and like everyone's laughing, and it does happen. World War I, you don't hear much about it, but here you go. Unbelievable. And that's part of the way that military, that you do, not just military, but you get in a bad situation, you know, a little humor goes a long way. A little humor goes a long way. Back to the book. We entered a trench. And this is, by the way, I'm obviously not reading the entire book. I'm going to some highlights, so there's a little bit of a skip, you know, time here as they move more towards the front. Back to the book. We entered a trench. Holes were scooped out in the side of it, just large enough to shelter a man crouching. Each hole contained a sleeping soldier who looked as dead as the occupant of a catacomb. Some of the holes had been blown in. All you saw of the late occupant was a protruding arm or leg. At best, there was a horrid similarity between the dead and the living. It seemed that the walls of the trenches had been built out of corpses, for one recognized the uniforms of French and the Huns. So you're in these trenches, and you're protected somewhat, but you got to dig another hole into the wall of the trench. And some of those guys get buried and killed, and the bodies are just there. Really, I mean, talk about hell.
Yeah.
Hell. Back to the book. The enemy shelling was growing more intense, as was always the way on the Somme. So we're there at the Somme, the Battle of Somme, when we were bringing out our wounded. A good many of our trenches were directly enfilade, and if you don't know what that is, enfilade is like, if you can imagine a line of people, and you were shooting down the line of people, and how much more exposed you are in that situation. So picture if I told you to shoot some of these tin cans, and I lined them up in a straight line perpendicular to you. You'd have to aim at each individual one, and you might hit it, you might not. If we put them all in a big line where they're parallel to you, or they go down the same gun target line that you have, you can, if you hit one, you might hit two, you might hit three, you might hit all of them with one shot. And so this is a bad situation to be in. You never want to have the enemy. They're basically on your flank, and you're lined up for them to shoot at you. It's a nightmare. Shells burst just behind the parapet. When they didn't burst on it, it was about this point in my breaking in that I received a blow to the head. And thank God for the man who invented the steel helmet. So he's getting hit with some shrapnel. Night came down, and we found that our carriage had no lights. It must have been nearing dawn when I was away. And again, I skipped a little bit, but here we are. Obviously, he's in a carriage. It must have been nearing dawn when I was wakened by the distant thunder of guns. I crouched in my corner, cold and cramped, trying to visualize the terror of it.